Convention of London 1861 *. The Convention of London was a treaty signed by France, Spain, and the United Kingdom. On the 31st of October 1861, the purpose of the treaty was to agree on a course of action towards obtaining loan repayments from Mexico. Although this went against the main tenet of the Monroe Doctrine, European non-intervention in the Americas, the United States was not in a position to offer much opposition. As it was engulfed in its own civil war, it led the three countries to dispatch an expedition to Mexico to seek a complete repayment of their debt. After the French made aggressive and unreasonable demands towards the Mexican government, Spain and Britain, realizing France's intention to turn Mexico into a puppet state, pulled their troops from Mexico and quickly signed treaties with Mexico, allowing them an indefinite hold on the repayment of debt. The resulting struggle is known as the French intervention in Mexico by the army of the Second French Empire, also known as the Maximilian Affair and the Franco-Mexican War. The Convention of London was preceded by a quadrilateral convention in 1860, by which France, Spain, Great Britain, and Prussia threatened intervention in Mexico unless the incapacity of its government was changed. The parties to the convention also invited the United States to seek a solution to the financial and social chaos in Mexico, a stalemate between the Mexican political parties, both of whose actions depended on the support of the said European nations and the United States, resulted in a 6-year civil war and rendered the country bankrupt. Earlier in May, the English Navy had disembarked a 400-man strong contingent at San Blas to secure the Mexican Pacific coast custom houses. The ongoing Civil War from 1858 resulted in both Mexican political parties becoming indebted. Aside from the country's previous loan contracts, the opposing sides ran out of funds and tried to cover their expenses in any way possible. Miguel Miramontes of the Conservatives chose to apply for a disadvantageous loan lent by creditor firm Jecker and Company. It was composed of 15 million pesos in internal bonds, 619,000 pesos in cash, and 368,000 in military clothing. These loans formed the basis of the long-term French claims, which led to the French intervention in Mexico. In 1862, Miramontes took a step further and seized a British deposit of 660,000 pesos reserved for the British bondholders by the Liberal cabinet of Benito Juárez. The same year, Juárez also crossed the line by illegally seizing 1,100,000 pesos at Laguna Seca that constituted the property of mainly Western European merchants. He immediately returned 1/3 of the plunder and promised to pay 12% interest on the rest after the Liberals' victory in the Civil War. 22-23 after their victory, Juárez expelled the Spanish minister for allegedly supporting the Miramontes faction, and his navy seized the Spanish steam frigate La Concepción. On the 11th of June 1861, Mexico passed the recompensation deadline of the Laguna Seca incident and was still not ready to repay the withheld money. Next month, the Mexican government suspended to transfer payments for 2 years. European claims British financial claims dated back to the end of 1851, when, at the Doyle Convention, Mexico agreed to pay 5 million pesos on a 3% yearly interest rate and a 5% redeem rate. At the time of the London Convention, these rates rose to 4% and 6% respectively, and the amount of debt had been reduced to 1,800,000 pesos. That same year, the Spanish and Mexican government settled an old claim of 983,000 pesos. The Juárez party still hadn't recognized the $2 million owed by the Santa Anna government, and additionally provided a new fund of 6,600,000 pesos, which was ratified 2 years later. The interest rate of the first bonds was set at 3%, while the latter was issued at 5%. Mexico also had similar negotiations with France in 1851 and 1853. Those claims totaled 1,759,000 pesos. The French also addressed unfulfillable individual claims on the behalf of French nationals living in Mexico. Such French nationals included a tailor in Mexico City who had been stabbed in front of his house, a bootmaker who had been robbed and seriously wounded, the relatives of a Frenchman who was assassinated at Puebla, allegedly by the Mexican police, a hotel keeper who had been robbed twice at Palmer, a farmer who was killed in Durango, a coach driver who was kidnapped and held for ransom several times, a colporteur who was murdered at Cuernavaca, and numerous other instances of robbery, torture or ill treatment of French subjects in Mexico. Similar claims were added to the Spanish claims as, well, including the killing of 5 Spanish nationals at Cuernavaca, and the reconciliation of the Spanish minister to Mexico, and the recovery of the lost ship Concepcion, altogether with the Jecker debt. France sought a consolidated 10 million pesos. The justness of the Jecker loan became questionable when United States intelligence intercepted an 1862 letter between the Jecker family and Charles de Morny, Duke of Morny, which clearly revealed the ambiguous motivation of the French financial aid and the personal interests of the Duke and Emperor Napoleon III behind it. The same concerns were brought up in the case of Mexico, where Juan de Bourbon seemed to be a possible pretender to the Mexican throne. Stance of the United States. The United States regarded the claims as unjustifiable or even outrageous, except for those of the British. However, the American government offered to cover the arrearages of the debt. This offer was rejected by the Allied powers. The U.S. remained neutral, but reserved its right to mobilize and intrude upon Mexican soil on behalf of the safety of its citizens and commercial sphere of interest, if necessary. An American naval blockade was set up in the Gulf of Mexico to secure the trade routes and key ports. This led to an accidental near collision between an American merchant vessel and the British steamboat Valorous. On another occasion, a near collision between steamers San Jacinto of the United States and Trent of Britain caused confusion. These incidents had the potential to escalate into a full-on military conflict between the two nations and thus Britain, not wishing to engage in war with the United States or causing her offense, decided to reduce its naval presence in the expedition. The treaty consisted of a preamble and 5 articles and had the following key points: the assembling of expedition and the launch of a joint expedition to take over the important ports of Mexico. The ports were the main target of the intervention, as 100% of the customs income on the Pacific coast and 85% of the Gulf of Mexico were spent redeeming international conventions. Permission to act freely to achieve the common goal and to protect European nationals was granted to the commanders of the operation. None of the participating nations could gain territorial, political, or financial advantage, nor could attempt to get involved in internal affairs. Coup d'état, or violation of the rights of Mexican people during the course of the intervention. A commission of 3 was empowered to enforce the claims and oversee the distribution of reparations. A formal invitation was forwarded to the United States to join the cause, provided that not in any case would it mean the delay of operations. Allied arrangements before taking Veracruz. The following arrangements were agreed upon before the Allied landing to Mexico. Note that these terms were not part of the treaty, as a preliminary precaution for defending the French in the city. The consul of France and the senior French commander should be informed in advance of any assault, so precautionary steps could be taken. The occupying forces should be half Spanish and half French. As a main objective of the intervention, the Mexican public treasuries, the custom houses, and administrative revenues should be overseen by an Allied tripartite commission and be sealed and reserved until the arrival of the commanders-in-chief. All forts, fortification, or public buildings should be left untouched. Their destruction should be only in last resort. To serve the purpose of self-defense. The Spanish naval blockade of Veracruz should not in any case affect the French maritime commerce after taking the city. The Spanish High Command should consult Napoleon III before advancing into inner Mexico or engaging in peace talks. All French possessions in Mexico must remain intact. Commodore Dunlop, commander of the British Navy, was given equal rights with his French counterpart, but could refrain from the battle in the event of lack of approval of his government. Second French intervention in Mexico. The Second French intervention in Mexico. Spanish Segunda Intervención Francesa en Mexico, also known as the Second Franco-Mexican War, 1861 to 1867, was a military invasion of the Republic of Mexico by the French Empire of Napoleon III, purportedly to force the collection of Mexican debts in conjunction with Great Britain and Spain. Mexican conservatives supported the invasion since they had been defeated by the liberal government of Benito Juárez in a 3-year civil war. Defeated on the battlefield, conservatives sought the aid of France to effect regime change and establish a monarchy in Mexico, a plan that meshed with Napoleon III's plans to re-establish the presence of the French Empire in the Americas. Although the French invasion displaced Juárez's republican government from the Mexican capital and the monarchy of Archduke Maximilian was established, the Second Mexican Empire collapsed within a few years. Material aid from the United States, whose 4-year civil war ended in 1865, invigorated the Republican fight against the regime of Maximilian, and the 1866 decision of Napoleon III to withdraw military support for Maximilian's regime accelerated the monarchy's collapse. The intervention came as a civil war. The Reform War had just concluded, and the intervention allowed the conservative opposition against the liberal, social, and economic reforms of President Juárez to take up their because once again, the Catholic Church, conservatives, much of the upper class and Mexican nobility, and some indigenous communities invited, welcomed, and collaborated with the French Empire to install Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. However, there was still significant support for republicanism in Mexico. Mexican society was most resistant to European models of governance, including monarchies. During and after the French intervention, the emperor himself, however, proved to be of liberal inclination and continued some of the Juárez government's most notable measures. Some liberal generals defected to the empire, including the powerful northern governor Santiago Vidori, who had fought on the side of Juárez during the Reform War. The French army landed in January 1862, aiming to rapidly take the capital of Mexico City, but Mexican Republican forces defeated them in the Battle of Puebla on the 5th of May, 1862, Cinco de Mayo, delaying their march on the capital for a year. The French and Mexican Imperial Army captured much of Mexican territory, including major cities, but guerrilla warfare by Republicans remained a significant factor, and Juárez himself never left the national territory. The intervention was increasingly using up troops and money at a time when the recent Prussian victory over Austria was inclining France to give greater military priority to European affairs. The liberals also never lost the official recognition of the United States of America in spite of their ongoing civil war. And following the defeat and surrender of the Confederate States of America in April 1865, the reunited country began providing material support to the Republicans. Invoking the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. government asserted that it would not tolerate a lasting French presence on the continent. Facing a mounting combination of domestic political discontent, diplomatic pressure, and the growing military threat of Prussia on the borders of metropolitan France itself, French units in Mexico began to redeploy to Europe in 1866, without substantial French support. The Second Mexican Empire collapsed in 1867. Maximilian and the two conservative generals, Miguel Miramontes and Tomás Mejía, were executed by firing squad on the 19th of June, 1867. Ending this period of Mexican history. Some Mexican conservatives had hopes of restoring Mexico to a monarchical form of government, as it had been pre-independence and at its inception in 1821. The first Mexican Empire of Augustin I, through his Spanish wife, Empress Eugenie de Montijo. The French Emperor Napoleon III came into contact with monarchist exiles José María Gutiérrez de Estrada and José Manuel Hidalgo y Esnariza, who exposed him to their decades-long effort to import a European prince to ascend a Mexican throne. Napoleon III was initially not interested due to the inevitable opposition that the effort would invite from the United States. But the outbreak of the American Civil War provided an opportunity. Napoleon III would also claim that the military adventure was a foreign policy commitment to free trade, and that the establishment of a European-derived monarchy in Mexico would ensure European access to Mexican resources, particularly French access to Mexican silver. However, his choice Emperor Maximilian would later disagree on Mexican resources going to anyone but Mexicans. More importantly, a French-dependent Mexico would restrain the growing power of the United States and replace it with French power in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. The support for monarchism in Mexico would also inspire strong resistance against European visions of modernity, which were frequently accompanied or driven by imperial campaigns. Many Mexicans would question claims to power and the use of gruesome militaristic violence as a means to progress civilization. The pretext for intervention came in July 1861, when Mexican President Benito Juárez placed a moratorium on foreign debt payments and expelled all remaining Spanish diplomats. The ambassador had been withdrawn over unpaid debt claims already in 1857, as he accused the Spanish of having supported the conservatives in the Reform War. In response, Spain, France, and a reluctant United Kingdom agreed to the Convention of London to ensure that debt repayments would be forthcoming. On the 14th of December, Spanish General Juan Prim occupied Mexico's main port, Veracruz, with 6,200 Spanish soldiers from Cuba. 2,000 French and 700 British forces joined them on the 7th of January, 1862. Historians have considered Prim, who was given powers as minister plenipotentiary to negotiate with the Mexican government, an unusual choice to lead the intervention. While well regarded by the people and in military circles for his experience as governor of Puerto Rico, observer in the Crimean War, and leader in the Moroccan War, he was also of liberal tendency and married to a Mexican citizen, Francisca de Aguirre, who was related to a member of Juárez's government. On the 10th of January, Prim issued a manifesto disavowing rumors that the Allies had come to conquer or to impose a new government. It was emphasized that the three powers merely wanted to open negotiations regarding their claims of damages. On the 14th of January, its bill of claims was presented to the government in Mexico City. Foreign Minister Manuel de Blado invited the commissioners to travel to Orizaba with 2,000 of their own troops for a conference, while requesting that the rest of the tripartite forces embark from Veracruz. The proposal to embark most troops was rejected, but negotiations then resulted in an agreement, ratified on the 23rd of January, to move the forces inland and hold the conference at Orizaba. The agreement also officially recognized the government of Juárez, along with Mexican sovereignty. On the 9th of April, agreements at Orizaba between the Allies broke down, as France made increasingly clear that it intended to invade Mexico and interfere in its government in violation of previous treaties. Prim consulted with the British, and the two agreed to retire their forces after securing that Mexico would devote 80% of custom revenues passing through Veracruz to settle debts with foreign nations. Though the British and Spanish agreed to depart at the same time, the perception was that Prim had precipitated the issue and decided on his own to put an end to what had been a Spanish-led project from the beginning. The decision angered the French, who had counted on Spanish support to ease their conquest of Mexico, like how France was helped by Spanish forces and bases in the Antilles for the ongoing conquest of Cochin China. But also the Captain General of Cuba, Francisco Serrano, who refused to provide Prim with additional ships for the evacuation, and Spanish conservatives who saw it as Prim abandoning a former Spanish colony, a betrayal of Spain's allies and Mexican conservatives sympathetic to Spain. Prime Minister Leopoldo O'Donnell was ambivalent. He did not want to alienate the French, but he didn't like their plan to install an Austrian monarch in Mexico, because the Austrian Empire had been a supporter of the Carlists during the First Carlist War and one of the last European states to recognize Isabel II as Queen of Spain. France was an ally of Spain, but Austria was not. The Queen, who had long hoped to install one of her own relatives as monarch in Mexico, prohibited O'Donnell to take any disciplinary action against Prim. French invasion on the 11th of April. Minister de Blado made it known to the French government that its intentions would lead to war. Certain Mexican officers had been sympathetic to the French since the beginning of the intervention. On the 16th of April, the French issued a proclamation inviting Mexicans to join them in establishing a new government. The next day, Mexican General Juan Almonte, who had been a foreign minister of the conservative government defeated in the Reform War, and who was brought back to Mexico by the French, issued his own manifesto, assuring the Mexican people of benevolent French intentions. Armed conflict broke out between the French and Mexican Republicans. The French defeated a small Mexican force at Escamilla and captured Orizaba. Mexican generals Porfirio Diaz and Ignacio Zaragoza retreated to El Ingenio, then headed towards Puebla. Almonte now attempted to consolidate the Mexican pro-French movement. The town of Orizaba joined him, and so did Veracruz and Isla del Carmen. Colonel González, Manuel Castellanos, Desiderio Samaniego, who, Father Miranda Ease, Aro Tamariz Ease, and General Antonio Taboada arrived in Orizaba to support Almonte. On the 28th of April, French forces headed towards Puebla. On the 5th of May, Mexican forces, commanded by Ignacio Zaragoza and Porfirio Diaz, won a major victory against the French at the Battle of Puebla, while the latter were trying to ascend the hill towards the fortified positions of the city. The French retreated to Orizaba to await reinforcements. Mexico's victory was a pause in the French push to capture Mexico City, delaying the French for a year. The celebration of Cinco de Mayo commemorates the Mexican victory. Conservative Mexican Generals Florentino Lopez, Leonardo Marquez, and Juan Vicario sought to join the French, and Mexican Republicans suffered defeats at Barranca, Sica and Cerro del Borrego in the vicinity of Orizaba. In response to the French defeat at Puebla, Napoleon III sent 30,000 troops under the command of Élie Frédéric Faure on July. The Emperor gave Faure instructions laying out France's occupation policy, directing him to work with Mexican supporters in the pursuit of both military and political goals. The aim was to establish a new government friendly to French interests, and preventing the United States from becoming too powerful in the Americas was also emphasized. Faure reached Orizaba on the 24th of October, 1862, and began planning another siege of Puebla, the defense of which had now passed on to Jesse González Ortega after Zaragoza died of typhoid on the 8th of September. On the 10th of January, 1863, a French squadron bombarded the Pacific port of Acapulco, and on 3 February 4 finally set out for Puebla. González Ortega had been building up the town's fortifications, and on the 10th of March he declared martial law. The French arrived on the 16th of March and began the siege of Puebla. On the 8th of May, Francois Achille Bozane and Leonardo Marquez defeated a force of new recruits under former Mexican President Ignacio Comonfort at the Battle of San Lorenzo.
And he was?
Coming to reinforce Puebla, Comonfort then retreated to Mexico City. Having run out of munitions and food, González Ortega held a council of war and agreed to surrender on the 17th of May, after destroying the remaining armaments. All officers were taken prisoner and intended to be transported to France, but González Ortega and Porfirio Díaz managed to escape. Proclamation of the Empire and international recognition upon hearing of the fall of Puebla. President Juárez prepared to evacuate the capital and move the Republican government to San Luis Potosí. Congress closed its session on the 31st of May after granting Juárez emergency powers. The French entered the capital on the 10th of June, 1863. On the 16th of June, the French government nominated 35 Mexican citizens to constitute a Junta Superior de Gobierno, who were then tasked with electing a triumvirate that was to serve as the executive of the new government. The three elected were General Almonte, Archbishop Labustida, and José Mariano Salas. The junta was also to choose 215 Mexican citizens who, together with the Junta Superior, were to constitute an assembly of notables that was to decide upon the form of government. On the 11th of July, the assembly published its resolutions that Mexico was to be a constitutional monarchy and that Ferdinand Maximilian was to be invited to accept the Mexican throne. The executive was then officially changed into the Regency of the Mexican Empire. The new monarchy was recognized in succession by the European countries of France, Austria, Belgium, Prussia, Portugal, Spain, Russia, the Netherlands, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the Ottoman Empire. Uncommonly for the era, Maximilian was recognized both by the Papal States and by the Kingdom of Italy. The latter wanted to maintain good relations with France and put diplomatic pressure on Austria, which had not yet recognized Italy. It was also hoped that Maximilian, as former viceroy of the Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia, would mediate the Italian acquisition of Veneto. In the Americas, only Guatemala and the Empire of Brazil extended recognition. The United States, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Chile, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, and Argentina all refused to recognize the monarchy and made declarations of support for the Juárez government. El Salvador, Chile, and Bolivia requested U.S. intervention, and the latter two offered to join in themselves. The Peruvian ambassador, Manuel Nicolas Corpancho, was expelled from Mexico City and died when the ship taking him out of the country sunk prior to accepting the crown and departing for Mexico in 1864. Maximilian expressed his desire for a mutual recognition and alliance with the breakaway Confederate States of America, which was reciprocated by the latter, but was prevented by the French government, which feared being dragged into war with the United States because of it. Conquest of central Mexico. Although Republican guerrilla forces in the countryside around the capital counted no victories against the French, they maintained a presence. Cuernavaca, Pachuca, and Tulancingo were captured by Franco-imperial forces in July. Guerrilla commanders Caterino Fragoso, Leon Ugalde, and others continued to wage warfare against towns occupied by the French. Juan Chavez, under the command of Tomás Mogia, defeated the Republican forces of Tomás O'Horan on the road to Guanajuato. O'Horan would then switch sides and join the Imperialists. Colonel José Antonio Rodríguez then captured San Juan de los Llanos in Puebla. The Mexican Gulf port of Tampico was captured by French vessels on the 11th of August. French control of the country still centered on Veracruz and Mexico City, but was gradually expanding. By October, advancing combined forces were spreading across the central regions of Mexico, from Jalisco to San Luis Potosí and Oaxaca. In August, Acaya captured Actopan. Hidalgo Imperialist commander Gavito managed to disperse Republican guerrillas in Cayuca, and Jesus Maria Visoso defeated Republican guerrillas at Puebla. Franco-Mexican forces under Leonardo Marquez and de Bertier entered Morelia, Acun, unopposed on the 30th of November after Republicans evacuated the city. After reinforcements arrived, Republicans led by José López Araga attempted to recapture Morelia, but were defeated by Marquez. Mejia captured Querétaro on the 17th of November, while Republican forces retreated further north to Guanajuato. Imperialist forces pursued them, and Guanajuato was taken on the 9th of December on the 22nd of December. The Republican government evacuated San Luis Potosí and intended to relocate north to the state of Coahuila. Mejia captured the city on the 25th of December, facing a Republican assault on the 27th of December, which was defeated. Bozane occupied Guadalajara on the 5th of January 1864. The liberal generals, José López Araga and Jesus González Ortega, remained in the vicinity but carried no attacks. After French assaults led by Abel Douay, González Ortega retreated towards Fresnillo, and Araga westward. General Felipe Navarrete proclaimed his support for the empire in Yucatan and attacked the state capital of Mérida with the support of French forces, capturing it on the 22nd of January 1864. Generals Douay and Armand Alexandre de Castigny headed north, capturing Aguascalientes and Zacatecas by the 7th of February. Castigny was left in charge of Zacatecas, while Douay went to the relief of Colonel Garnay in Guadalajara. On the 16th of February, Castagny won a battle at Calatlan in which he took 80 prisoners, and Republican General Luigi Gallardi was executed. The Republican governor of Aguascalientes, General José María Chávez Alonso, was also executed after being captured in Harris. Imperialists struggled to hold on to the southern state of Chiapas. The nearby state capital of Tabasco, Villahermosa, was recaptured by Republicans on the 27th of February. The success inspired a Republican incursion to Veracruz, capturing Minatitlan on the 28th of March. On the 19th of March, the Western Mexican commander Manuel Lozada, at the head of indigenous troops of the Tepic district, sided with the Imperialists. Douay headed south, pursuing the Republican guerrillas of Simon Gutierrez and Antonio Rojas, routing the former and destroying 2 factories of arms and powder near Cocula. In March, Douay entered Colima. González Ortega and several guerrilla bands were driven back into the Sierra. Hermosa, after Manuel de Blado was repulsed by Mejia in his attempted assault on Monterrey. De Blado fled for the United States and died a year later. Mejia was subsequently granted the Cross of the Legion of Honor by Napoleon. Maximilian and his wife Charlotte of Belgium arrived in Veracruz in the summer of 1864 and were later crowned in the Mexico City Metropolitan Cathedral. Porfirio Diaz defeated the imperialist Marcos Toledo at the silver mining town of Taxco on the 26th of October 1864. Diaz then besieged the brigade of Juan Vicario in Iguala until imperialist reinforcements forced him to abandon the siege. Diaz headed south to his home state of Oaxaca and increased his troops to 8,000. The imperialists now controlled the central Mexican states, their major cities, 2/3 of the population, mines and agricultural lands, and the main centers of manufacturing and trade. The Republicans controlled the sparsely populated frontier states of the north, where Juarez led from Monterrey. These northern states granted them revenue coming into the Pacific ports of Manzanillo, Mazatlan, and Guaymas. Arms also flowed in from the U.S. states of California and Texas. Along with mercenaries, the Republicans also held the southern states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, Tabasco, and Chiapas, under the command of Porfirio Diaz's northern campaign, the Imperialists. now focused on capturing the north, with Mayo campaigning along the northern Gulf Coast. Supported by Charles Louis Dupin's anti-guerrilla corps at Tampico and Edouard Amerd's brigade at San Luis Potosi, Castagni supported the rear, and the entire operation was headquartered at Querétaro on the Pacific. A naval squadron under Thomas Louis Lenormand de Kergrest was ready to cooperate with Duane Jalisco and push towards Sinaloa. They were aided by quarrels within the Republican leadership that resulted in José López Araga being demoted and subsequently joining the Imperialists. On the 26th of September, 1864, the Imperialists captured Baghdad, Tamaulipas, controlling every major port in the Gulf. The commander at Baghdad, Juan Cortina, defected to the Imperialists. Santiago Vidori, the joint governor of Nuevo León and Coahuila, had broken with Juárez in March 1864 over the administration and finances of his state, and even held a referendum on joining the empire. Republican troops drove him into Texas, but Vijuari loyalist troops remained in the region. As Republican forces in the north were diverted by imperial advances, Vidori's forces captured Monterrey on the 15th of August, with Juárez barely escaping and pursued as far as Paris in a bullet-riddled carriage. Vidori then headed towards Mexico City, where he was made a counselor of Emperor Maximilian. By the end of the year, the Imperialists controlled Nuevo León and the greater part of Coahuila to the banks of the Rio Grande. Pacific Campaign on the 28th of October, 1864. Marquez and Dewey attacked the army of José María Artiga in the ravine of Atenquique, routing him. A few days later, the guerrillas of Simor Unguti Rrez and Antonio Rojas were defeated near the U.S. border by General Carlos Rivas with French support. Marquez occupied Colima, and by the 18th of November, Marquez had captured the port of Manzanillo. On the 12th of November, 1864, de Kergrest's fleet arrived at Mazatlan and demanded surrender under threat of bombardment. At the same time, the Manuel Lozada besieged the town leading to its capture. Juan Vicario was repulsed at Chilapa de Lvarez, while on the way to replace the French garrison in the Pacific port of Acapulco. And subsequently, the port had to be evacuated and left to the Republicans in December. French vessels succeeded in recapturing Acapulco on the 11th of September. The Imperialists hoped to dislodge Porfirio Diaz from his stronghold in the south, and began to survey the land and build roads. Towards the end of 1864, General Courtois d'Urbil entered Oaxaca by way of Santo Domingo Yan-Hitlan, and other columns followed from Orizaba and Mexico City. Diaz was based in Oaxaca City with 3,000 regulars, 3,000 troops in the mountains, and had fortified the city. Bazaine decided to lead the siege of Oaxaca in person, and by the end of January 1865, the besieging forces numbered 7,000 men. The use of artillery began on the 4th of February, and an assault was ordered on February 9th. The massing of forces produced panic among the besieged, and Diaz surrendered. Diaz was imprisoned at Puebla, but he escaped again after 7 months and raised an army in Guerrero. This prompted Elie Frederick Faure, the former commander of French forces in Mexico, to criticize Bazaine for not executing Diaz. The defector, José López Araga, sent a letter to Diaz, hoping to win him over to the imperialist cause, arguing that guerrilla warfare was devastating the country and assuring him that Mexican independence was secure under Maximilian. Diaz rejected this. Offered French Colonel Mongan remained at Oaxaca and reorganized the civilian government. Imperialist forces would continue to face sporadic conflict with Republicans led by General Luis Pérez Figueroa. Michoacán continued to be a Republican stronghold, serving as a base for Nicolas's Regiles E's, Fr. Manuel Garcia, Pueblita E's, Carlos Salazar Ruiz, and Vicente Riva Palacio. with the latter being named governor by Artigas, who held supreme command of the regional forces after Diaz's capture. On the 31st of January, Nicolas Romero was defeated at Apatzingán by Colonel Poiter. On the 19th of May, Salazar defeated a Franco-Mexican force at Los Reyes. Artigas occupied Tacámbaro, and Leon Ugalde and Fermín Valdés captured Zitácuaro. Regulus ventured into Guanajuato, then back to Michoacán, where he recaptured Tacámbaro. On the 11th of April, where the Imperialists lost a significant number of Belgian mercenaries. The town, however, was soon taken back. Regulus once again ventured towards Morelia, but was stopped at Huaniqueo by Poitiers in Jalisco. Duay's operations resulted in guerrilla commander Antonio Rojas being killed on the 28th of January, 1865, at Potrerillos. The operations led by Duay and Manuel Lozada resulted in the defection of the commander of the Republican Central Forces, Miguel Maria de Exegari, along with General Romulo Valle. In January 1865, Castagni went to Mazatlan to follow up on the imperialist victory there from the previous November. Fierce warfare ensued with General Ramon Corona, and Lozada was sent to aid Castagni, resulting in the imperialist victory at El Rosario in April 1865. Corona fled north but returned in September with a victory at Mazatá. The success at Mazatá was so aside. Allowed the imperialists to turn their attention towards the northwest coast, with Castagni hoping to capture Guaymas. A French squadron landed several hundred men under Colonel Garnier on the 29th of March. Garnier sent troops by sea to Alamos and managed to gain support among the Yaqui, Mayo, and Opata. Chief Refugio Tenori arrived at Guaymas with reinforcements, allowing the imperialists to win the Battle of Alamos on the 24th of September, then marched to Hermosillo. Republican counteroffensive *, the effective Union victory in the American Civil War in April 1865 marked a turning point in the French intervention. U.S. President Abraham Lincoln never recognized the government of Maximilian, but could not aid the Republican cause in Mexico until his own war ended. Mexican Republicans were hopeful that surplus arms and Union troops would aid them. Lincoln was assassinated shortly after major hostilities in the American Civil War ended. His successor, Andrew Johnson, never considered overt U.S. intervention. But he did not stop the flow of demobilized Civil War veterans heading south to volunteer for the Republicans. Maximilian received a message from the Juarez government advising him to leave the country while he could. Juarez was now confident of his victory, writing that the United States will never permit Maximilian to consolidate his power, and his sacrifices and victories will have counted for nothing. Continued Northern Campaign and Black Decree. Miguel Negrete occupied Saltillo and Monterrey, which had been abandoned by the imperialists, and advanced towards Matamoros with American volunteers. Juan Cortina, who had previously defected to the imperialists, now returned to the Republicans. They succeeded in capturing all towns along the Rio Grande from Piedras Negras downstream, but retreated from Matamoros after facing Tomás Mejía and French troops. Colonel Pedro José Méndez captured Ceuta Victoria on the 23rd of April, 1865, and Ceuta Tula on the 4th of June. Cutting off communications from imperialist-held Tampico, Bazaine dispatched Generals Auguste Henry Brincourt and Baron Niger towards the Mapimi border to go after Negrete. Meanwhile, Colonel Pierre-Joseph Janingros left San Luis Potosi to rendezvous with the imperialists at Saltillo. Negrete skirmished with Janingros on the 31st of May and retreated. His forces were disbanded after being pursued by the imperialists. A concentration of U.S. troops and vessels in Texas was answered by a surge of imperialist forces along the border. which limited guerrillas to more southern states. Asterisk, some imperial prefects resigned, unable to govern or defend their respective departments without enough troops. Asterisk, in August. As French troops were concentrated in the north under Bazaine, Sinaloa was left protected only by one regiment under Colonel Carteret in Guaymas, while the surrounding areas were entrusted to Indian allies. Antonio Rosales was killed in August attempting to retake Alamos, but Ramon Corona pressed upon the imperialists and succeeded in driving French troops from Sinaloa to Mazatlan. After defeating Negrete, Brincourt advanced towards Chihuahua. He entered Chihuahua City, the provisional capital of the Republic, on the 15th of August, reorganized the administration, and provided encouragement to the indigenous allies of the empire in the region. Juarez fled to El Paso del Norte on the U.S.-Mexican border. Fearing a skirmish with American forces, Bazaine ordered Brincourt to return to Durango within 3 weeks of reaching Chihuahua. Brincourt believed that leaving a garrison of 1,000 men in Chihuahua was enough to pacify the region, but Bazaine repeated his orders, and he left on the 29th of October. On the 1st of October, the Republican government arranged a loan in New York City for $30 million. Asterisk, on the 2nd of October. Partly in response to the Americans on the Republican side. Citation needed. Maximilian issued the Black Decree. The troops under your orders will take no prisoners. Every individual of whatever rank taken with arms in his hands shall be put to death. In the future, let there be no exchange of prisoners. Let our soldiers understand that they cannot surrender to such men. This is a death struggle. On both sides, it is only a question of killing or be killed. Asterisk. Less severe penalties were prescribed for aiding guerrillas, and exceptions were made for those who were forced into service or were involved circumstantially. Asterisk. On the 13th of October, Colonel Ramon Mendez defeated and captured Generals Artiga and Salazar Ruiz at Amatlan, the latter commander-in-chief of the Republican Army of the Center, both of whom were executed. Asterisk. Mariano Escobedo attempted to take Matamoros. On the 25th of October, Mejia hesitated to take the offensive due to the presence of U.S. troops nearby, until French reinforcements arrived and scattered Escobedo's forces on the 8th of November. Asterisk. Juarez returned to Chihuahua City on the 20th of November. Maximilian, however, had convinced Bazaine to keep Chihuahua, and an expedition marched on the city under the command of Jean-Baptiste Billet. Juarez was forced to leave yet again for the border on the 9th of December. Asterisk. Escobedo took Monterrey, but a remnant of imperial forces remained in the citadel and held out until General Pierre-Joseph Ginegros arrived on the 25th of November. Recapturing the city, Mejia and the French naval commander Georges Charles Cloe protested to the United States the aid in material, supplies, hospital care, and troops lent to the Republicans, but Godfrey Weitzel, commander of Clarksville, now a disappeared town at the mouth of the Rio Grande, replied that such troops did not belong to the U.S. Army. In January 1866, African-American troops from Clarksville raided Baghdad and fired on French vessels, a blatant violation of neutrality, which resulted in the United States government removing Weitzel and disciplining the soldiers involved. Asterisk. French withdrawal from the North. Asterisk. At the opening of the French chambers in January 1866, Napoleon III announced that he would withdraw French troops from Mexico. In reply to a French request for neutrality, the U.S. Secretary of State, William H. Seward, said that French withdrawal should be unconditional. Napoleon III assured the Americans that the withdrawal would no longer be deferred, laying out a plan to reduce the troops in phases starting in November 1866 and ending 1 year later in November 1867. Seward requested that French reinforcements to Mexico should cease now, and that Austria should stop recruiting volunteers for the Mexican expedition. The French and Austrian governments complied. Asterisk. On the 31st of January, Billet left Chihuahua City in charge of Indian allies, but it fell to Republican troops in March. Maximilian ordered Bazaine to retake Chihuahua in May, and a new expedition was prepared. But new withdrawal instructions from France caused the expedition to be abandoned. French troops were evacuated from Durango in November, and Castagny withdrew to Leon, Guanajuato, leaving the state to the Republicans. Juarez moved the government to Durango on the 26th of December, 1866. In Sonora and Sinaloa, the French were mostly confined to the ports of Guaymas and Mazatlan, though General Edvard Emile Langberg held positions in the interior with the aid of Opata. Natives, Alamos was captured by the Republican Angel Martinez with Sinaloan forces and punished the indigenous Mayo and Yaqui peoples that had allied with the empire. He entered Hermosillo on the 4th of May, only to lose it to the imperialists the day after. The French withdrew from Guaymas in September, and around the same time Langberg was killed in a battle for years. Sonora fell to the Republicans and hundreds fled to the United States or tried to follow the French. Imperialist commanders Refugio Tenori and José Almada were captured and executed with their families. Southern Campaign in July 1865. Artiga advanced towards Tacambaro, where he was routed by Lieutenant Colonel van der Smissen. In Michoacán, Ragos was repeatedly repulsed to the point that his forces dissolved in April 1866. In May, however, he resumed operations and made it into the Toluca region, finding allies around Zitácuaro and Guerrero. Acapulco was held by the imperialist General Montenegro, but his troops were greatly weakened by fever and desertion. After Porfirio Diaz escaped, he fled to Oaxaca and hoped to form a new army. The imperialist prefect Prieto had held Tehuantepec since mid-1865 and hoped to turn it into a base for operations. Diaz encroached in the spring of 1866, attacking Jameltepec and Puebla to cut off communications between Oaxaca and Puebla. Diaz took Tezcatlipan in August before he was repulsed by Austro-Mexican forces. In early October, Diaz routed the General Oranos, who barely escaped and retreated into Oaxaca City, after which Diaz began to siege. An Austro-Mexican relief expedition was defeated by Diaz, and Oaxaca City fell on the 1st of November. From there, he completed the capture of Oaxaca and advanced into Puebla, Gulf Campaign in the northeast. Pedro José Mendez blocked the route to Tampico. Escobedo was based north of Linares, and González Herrera and Geronimo Trevico were around Parras. After a Republican assault on Parras, Imperialist Bryant came from Saltillo and reinstalled the Imperialist prefect Campos on 20 February. He then attacked the Republicans at Santa Isabel, Chihuahua, where, due to underestimating their forces, was routed and captured. The Republicans did not immediately take Parras, but the French withdrawal let them in. In June 1866, at Charco Escondido, Mejia was joined by Jean Ingros in April, another train of reinforcements, led by General Olvera who left Matamoros but were surrounded and defeated by Escobedo near Camargo. Olvera retreated to Matamoros, but the Imperialist Tuz, who had arrived with reinforcements from Monterrey, was obliged to retreat. Clarification needed, left with only 500 men. Mejia retreated on the 23rd of June to Veracruz. In November, Matamoros fell to the Republicans with the aid of U.S. troops. On the 9th of November, the Imperialist generals Marquez and Miramon returned from Europe to aid in the war effort. By the end of November, the French withdrawal had resulted in the Republicans taking back the north and west of the country. On the 13th of November, the French completed the evacuation of Mazatlan. After aiding the evacuation, the former imperialist Lozada retired from the conflict and proclaimed his neutrality. Republican Méndez, who had raided communications between San Luis Potosi and the Gulf of Mexico, was killed during an imperialist raid near Tampico. However, due to the French withdrawal, the Republican Aureliano Rivera captured Tampico in May. The French held the port but surrendered in July, and in August they also surrendered Tuxpan. Veracruz was the only Gulf port left under imperialist control. Monterrey was evacuated by the imperialists on the 25th of July. And Saltillo, on the 4th of August, Douay evacuated Matehuala on the 28th of October, then the northernmost imperial post. Troops were left in San Luis Potosi under Mejia, but he retreated on Christmas Eve to San Felipe, Guanajuato. Castagni reached Guanajuato around the same time, with French forces from Durango and Zacatecas evacuated in November. French withdrawal from central Mexico. Veracruz and the roads leading to it were harassed by Republicans since the beginning of 1866. The imperialists won a battle at the Papaloapan River. But by August, Tlacotalpan and Alvarado, Veracruz surrendered to the Republicans. A revolt led by Ignacio Alatorre was crushed in Papantla and Misantla. But with Republican successes further north, Alatorre rose up again, capturing Jalapa in November. Pachuca was captured by Republicans in November, and Paraty, Veracruz, fell in January 1867. Mexico City became vulnerable in late 1866. Cotetlan was raided in October. Tias, Covarrubias, and Tilopen were left exposed to Republican incursions in December. While raiders harassed the stream of imperial soldiers and refugees heading to Veracruz, the imperialist commander Ortiz de la Pena retreated to Cuernavaca after a defeat at Ixtla. And Regules and Vicente Riva Palacio occupied the Lerma Valley. Guadalajara was abandoned by the French on the 12th of December 1866, and imperial forces were left under General Gutierrez. The imperialists evacuated the city on the 19th of December and headed for Guanajuato. The former imperial commander Lozada declared the neutrality of Nayarit, On the 19th of December 1866, Napoleon III announced that all French troops would be withdrawn, ahead of prior schedule. In late December, the French evacuated Guanajuato, rendezvousing in Querétaro with troops from San Luis Potosi and head towards Veracruz. However, an imperialist garrison under Mejia remained at Guanajuato and was able to keep the Republicans at bay. Bazaine evacuated Mexico City on the 5th of February 1867. Veracruz was left to the imperialist General Pérez Gómez. More than 30 vessels, including transports, mail steamers, and squadron ships, helped the evacuation of Veracruz. Bazaine and the last French troops embarked for Toulon on the 12th of March. Fall of the Empire. After a council at Orizaba, which decided against his abdication, Maximilian intended to return to Mexico City, first remaining at Puebla for nearly 3 weeks and making preparations for the campaign. The country was divided into 3 military districts, the western comprising the provinces north of Colima, including Durango and Chihuahua, the eastern stretching from Aguascalientes and Tampico northward, and the central embracing all the vast remainder to Chiapas. Miraman took command of the western district, Mejia of the east with nearly 4,000 men, and Marquez, the center, with 4,000 under Ramon Méndez in Michoacán. 2,000 more troops were stationed in Puebla, where Maximilian assumed supreme command, issuing orders for the active formation of the new imperial army as well as a militia. However, the western and eastern military districts were already largely in possession of the Republicans, as well as the region south of Puebla, while the few remaining central provinces were overrun by hostile bands and about to be invaded by Republican armies. Funds and resources were also lacking. On the 27th of January 1867, Miraman took Aguascalientes and nearly succeeded in capturing President Juarez, but Governor Aza managed to save him. How Miraman retired to join Castillo, who, at San Luis Potosi, Escobedo figured Mejia's intention and intercepted him at San Jacinto on the 1st of February. rooting him. Miramon escaped with Castillo and took refuge in Querétaro. The Republicans captured Guanajuato and Morelia. The Imperialists retreated from Michoacán to the limits of San Luis Potosí and Querétaro. Siege of Querétaro, Maximilian joined. The army at Querétaro, along with Minister Agria, Leonardo Marquez, and Miguel López with Huén pesos, 1,600 men and 12 cannons. Maximilian reached Querétaro on the 19th of February and was received by Miramon and other generals who held a reception for the emperor. A few days after, a review of the troops was held, showing 9,000 men with 39 cannons, including about 600 Frenchmen, who had chosen to remain in Mexico. Miramon was placed at the head of the infantry, of which Castillo and Casanova received a division each. Méndez assumed command of the reserve brigade, in which López served as colonel. Mejia became chief of the cavalry, Reyes of engineers, and Arellano of the artillery. Marquez, chief of the general staff, was accorded the foremost place. To the affront of Miramon in the First Council of War, held on the 22nd of February, it was agreed to fight the Republicans before their combined forces became too strong. But ultimately, this strategy, which historian Hubert Howe Bancroft suggested could have achieved victory, was rejected on the advice of Marquez. As the Republicans began to surround Querétaro, Marquez suggested retreating to Mexico City to gather forces and face the Republicans in one final battle. This was dismissed as impractical. On the 5th of March, the Republicans prepared for the siege of Querétaro. After fighting had begun, Marquez again suggested to retreat to Mexico City, but Miramon and others opposed it. Miramon planned a counterattack to recover the hill of San Gregorio on the 17th of March. When the time arrived, however, a false alarm arose that the Imperialist headquarters were under attack, leading to the assault being cancelled. Miramon now wanted to destroy the western positions of the Republicans, providing a retreat if needed. Marquez was assigned to go to Mexico City for reinforcements. Miramon provided a distraction on the 22nd of March, leading an expedition down the valley, which captured a quantity of provisions. Marquez was able to depart during the night with the 10 Lombay horsemen, and Miramon became the commander at Querétaro after the Imperialists repulsed another Republican assault. Miramon, during an award ceremony, took one of the medals and asked to decorate the emperor for his conduct during the battle, which Maximilian accepted. On the 1st of April, Miramon led a counterattack at San Gregorio, but the result was indecisive. As news of Marquez failed to arrive, a second mission was sent to Mexico City. Miramon urged Maximilian to leave, but the emperor chose to stay. The mission failed. Clarification needed, and the leading officers urged surrender. The Imperialists planned to fight their way out of Querétaro. And as preparation, Miramon attacked the Cementerio Hill on the 27th of April. The Imperialists surprised the Republicans, dispersing thousands and taking 500 prisoners. But the Imperialists squandered vital time planning their next move, and Republican reserves arrived to get final victory. The Imperialists now sought to break through enemy lines into the Sierra Gorda Mountains and possibly the coast. The operation was scheduled for the 15th of May. However, before this was carried out, the Imperialists were betrayed by López, and on the night of the 14th of May, he opened the gates of Querétaro to the Republicans in exchange for gold. Republicans quickly overwhelmed the city, and Miramon, Mejia, and Maximilian were taken prisoner. Execution of Maximilian following a court-martial. Maximilian was sentenced to death. Many European monarchs and other prominent figures, including Victor Hugo and Giuseppe Garibaldi, pleaded Juarez for Maximilian's life to be spared. But he refused to commute the sentence. He believed he had to send a strong message that Mexico would not tolerate any government imposed by foreign powers. Maximilian was executed on 19 Junalum, with Generals Miguel Miraman and Tomás Magallán the Cerro de las Campanas. Outside Querétaro, Mexico City surrendered the day after Maximilian's execution. Juárez returned to the national capital. He actually made few changes in policy because the progressive Maximilian had kept most of Juárez's liberal reforms. Aftermath: the Mexican Conservative Party was so thoroughly discredited by its alliance with the French that it became effectively defunct. The Liberal Party was almost unchallenged during the first years of the restored republic. In 1871, Juárez was elected for another term in spite of a constitutional prohibition of re-elections. Porfirio Díaz, one of the losing candidates, launched a rebellion against Juárez, supported by more conservative factions within the Liberal Party. The attempted revolt Plan de la Noria was nearly defeated when Juárez died on the 19th of July, 1872. Díaz ran against interim President Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, lost, and retired to his hacienda in Oaxaca. 4 years later, in 1876, when Lerdo ran for re-election, Díaz launched a second successful revolt, the Plan de Tuxtepec, and captured the presidency. He held it through 8 terms until 1911, a period known as the Porfiriato. France's adventure in Mexico improved relations with Austria through Maximilian but produced no lasting results. In 1866, Prussia defeated Austria in the Austro-Prussian War, while French troops were still in Mexico. The Second French Empire would itself collapse in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. U.S. diplomacy and involvement as early as 1859. U.S. and Mexican efforts to ratify the Maclean-Ocampo Treaty had failed in the divided United States Senate, where tensions were high between the North and the South over slavery. Such a treaty would have allowed U.S. construction in Mexico and protection from European forces in exchange for a payment of $4 million to the heavily indebted government of Benito Juárez. On the 3rd of December, 1860, President James Buchanan delivered a speech stating his displeasure at being unable to secure Mexico from European interference. European governments would have been deprived of all pretext to interfere in the territorial and domestic concerns of Mexico. We should have thus been relieved from the obligation of resisting, even by force, should this become necessary, any attempt of these governments to deprive our neighboring republic of portions of her territory, a duty from which we could not shrink without abandoning the traditional and established policy of the American people. United States policy did not change during the French occupation. Abraham Lincoln expressed his sympathy to Latin American republics against any European attempt to establish a monarchy. Shortly after the establishment of the imperial government in April 1864, United States Secretary of State William H. Seward, while maintaining U.S. neutrality, expressed discomfort at the imposition of a monarchy in Mexico. Nor can the United States deny that their own safety and destiny to which they aspire are intimately dependent on the continuance of free republican institutions throughout America. On the 4th of April, 1864, Congress passed a joint resolution, resolved, and c. that the Congress of the United States are unwilling, by silence, to leave the nations of the world under the impression that they are indifferent spectators of the deplorable events now transpiring in the Republic of Mexico, and they therefore think fit to declare that it does not accord with the policy of the United States to acknowledge a monarchical government, erected on the ruins of any republican government in America under the auspices of any European power. Near the end of the American Civil War, representatives at the 1865 Hampton Roads Conference briefly discussed a proposal for a North-South reconciliation by a joint action against the French in Mexico. In 1865, through the selling of Mexican bonds by Mexican agents in the United States, The Juárez administration raised between $16 million and $18 million for the purchase of American war material. Between 1865 and 1868, General Hermann Sturm acted as an agent to deliver guns and ammunition to the Mexican Republic. In 1866, General Philip Sheridan was in charge of transferring additional supplies and weapons to the Liberal Army, including some 30,000 rifles directly from the Baton Rouge Arsenal in Louisiana. By 1867, Seward shifted American policy from thinly veiled sympathy for the Republican government of Juárez to open threat of war to induce a French withdrawal. Seward stated in 1868 the Monroe Doctrine, which 8 years ago was merely a theory, is now an irreversible fact. Asterisk,